So you've been shooting all your images with your iPhone, and now you've decided to upgrade and get a real camera. The natural thing to do is to shoot in JPEG mode. This means that the files that come out of your camera are ready to share, and they look great, and you're on your way. But you've heard a little bit about RAW format. And so why would you want to shoot in RAW? I'll break all this down for you coming up. Hi, I'm Terry Vanderheiden, full-time professional photographer, and today we're going to talk about RAW files and why you're going to want to start shooting in RAW. Now, back when I was getting started in professional photography, back in the film days before digital, in order to create images for publications, we had to supply images that were in transparency form. So either little slides or large transparencies. These were full color images in the form of slides or transparencies. Now, my preference was Kodachrome 64, and the images were shot on a roll of 36 slides per roll of film. Now, my only ISO on that film was 64, kind of limiting compared to what we have today at our fingertips, because now we can go up to ISOs 12,800 and even beyond if we want. While we dealt with the restrictions of shooting slides, only 36 shots before roll change, a single ISO, waiting a week to get the images processed. The biggest obstacle we faced was getting the exposure right. If you were off just a little and maybe your highlights were too bright or the shadows were too dark, there was no saving that image. There was no Lightroom back then to lift the shadows and fix highlights. When the image came back tucked into that little cardboard frame, that was as good as it got. You had to make the images perfect out of the camera. When digital photography came along, all the early generation cameras only shot JPEG files. And this was a lot like shooting transparencies. So whatever you did in the camera is what you got. Now, in the hands of a professional photographer, you might have a better shot at getting the proper exposure of your JPEGs. But most situations just don't allow us to shoot in JPEGs that are in perfect exposure, just at least not that often. Even with all the experience of shooting those unforgiving slides and transparencies and having to get the exposure right on, there are a few professional photographers that would choose to shoot only in JPEG mode. Nowadays, we have the luxury of shooting RAW images. So as a professional photographer, and just about every pro I've ever run into, they shoot in RAW format. While JPEG is basically a photograph when it comes out of the camera, the RAW file's not. A RAW file is just a bunch of code strung together, and you have to have a program that will decipher all that code and make it into an image that you can view. This is a whole extra step that turns your RAW files from information into a photograph. What a hassle, you're thinking, right? Why would pros ever want to shoot in RAW? It just takes so much extra time. So the reason is simple. After the image is created, more changes can be made to the image to get the perfect exposure. And we can even use creativity to make it even better than we thought possible. First, we need to talk a little bit about JPEG files. The advantage to JPEG files is they're compressed. They're processed right out of the camera in the style that you like. Now, most cameras have a style choice on them that you can specifically pick out how your images are going to look. So right out of the camera, you can share the images with others almost instantly. You don't have to learn a RAW processing program like Lightroom to even view your images. And they take up much less space on your memory cards than a RAW file does. They're quick to download and they take up a lot less space on your hard drives. You can also simply store them on a cloud service because of their small size. You don't need a bunch of hard drives to hold all your images. With all these advantages, why would a professional ever want to shoot anything but JPEGs? Well, the answer is simple. The advantages of creating a finished, high-quality image are superior when you're shooting RAW files. These advantages outweigh all of those JPEG advantages. For me, most of all, my final images that I send to magazines, advertisements, and prints are all JPEGs. I simply process the images on RAW, and then I export the final image as a JPEG file. So it ends up being a JPEG file anyway. Most cameras have that feature of shooting RAW and JPEG simultaneously. Now, I encourage you to do this because it does take more space on your cards, but it gives you the opportunity to shoot JPEGs now that you don't have to learn anything to use them, and then store away your RAW files. You can come back to them at another time. So let me show you some examples. And by the way, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to give the video a thumbs up. And while you're at it, subscribe to my channel and be sure to click the little bell to be notified of my next video. All right, let's get into this. All right, so right now I'm in Lightroom and I'm going to show you how I process the RAW files and give you a little bit of information about what we can do with RAW files. So for starters, I took a couple of shots. So I set my camera on JPEG and RAW. I only do this for demonstrations because now I just shoot in RAW because I process everything in Lightroom. I don't need the JPEG files. But I shot both of these images here in JPEG and RAW. So you can see down here that this first one is a JPEG, JPG, that's the signification, that's a JPEG. And this one here is a .nef, which means it's a Nikon electronic file, so that's a RAW file. So let's take a look at this. As we bring this up, we can go over to the Develop module. And again, I'll teach you more about using the Develop module in my later Lightroom classes. But just suffice it to say, as we come over here, we want to change the exposure, for instance. So we make this slider and we pull it over and we're trying to get some more detail back in the sky that was overexposed. And you can see here, as we zoom in, that there's still not a ton of detail back in this building. The sky is pretty white. While it's darker, it's not exactly light, it doesn't give you any more detail. It's just a little darker. So in this case, this is the JPEG, and we're limited at how much information is in a JPEG because a JPEG is a completed file, where the RAW file has so much more information in depth that we can maybe pull some things out of it. So let's go to the identical shot, and this was done in the RAW file, and now watch what happens when we slide over the exposure. Wow, look at that. Not only are we getting real blue back in that sky, we're getting some detail back in this building. So we can actually bring the highlights down on this building, bring the exposure down. And now let's take a look. And look, there's actually detail in that building where we can see the sky and the clouds. And when we look at these two next to one another, you'll see that it's way different, right? It is way different in terms of how these look. So as you look at the same part of the building, no detail in the JPEG, but yet there's detail in the RAW file. Detail in the sky, no detail in the sky. So this, to me, is reason enough to just switch over and start shooting RAW because it can save your exposures. When you create an image, it can save your exposures of how it looks, right? So here's an example I shot in San Francisco. This image would be lost. It's too bright. You can't do anything with it. But since I shot it in RAW, we can come over here, bring the exposure down, and look at that. We're bringing back the entire city with one little slider because the RAW file had so much depth and information into it. When you have this much depth of information, you can be off a little bit on your exposure and still pull some really nice stuff out of it. Another thing that's really great about RAW files is, so let's go to this JPEG file here for a quick second one more time. If we go into the Develop module and we're looking at color, we have an opportunity to shoot it as shot or auto or custom. So these are the three things that we can pick to choose from our color changes. So not a whole lot. Otherwise, you're manually going in and altering the color as best as you can. In RAW, here's some RAW files that were shot, obviously in the wrong format of color space in my camera. And over here, as shot, we can find something that we might like a little bit better. So let's say we go to cloudy. Well, instantly, it color corrects that image. So here we are in Lightroom, and we have the ability to instantly color correct that image. Another way is to come over here to the eyedropper tool and select something we know to be black, gray, or white, click on it, instantly color corrects it. And of course, since we're in Lightroom, it's so cool because we can go in here and take a look at this. Here's one that we just did. We can click on that, click on the other two that weren't changed yet, and then synchronize that. Oops, cancel, sorry, sync settings. And then we just hit synchronize, and then it color corrects those just in a couple of clicks of the button, particularly if you don't go to the wrong screen. So this is another cool thing with RAW. You got a lot more depth in your color inside of it. So here's another image that we shot. You can almost not tell exactly what it is. We go into the develop module and we say, let's lighten this thing up to see what we have. So we can lighten it up, and wow, sure enough, we've got ourselves an image that's worth keeping. So we have the color in the foliage, the waterfall. You can take it a few steps further in Lightroom, and again, I'll show you in detail on this in some upcoming videos, but you can come over here to dehaze and take some of the contrast out of the area that's right next to the waterfall. We can take and bring up the saturation of the color of those. And we look at that, we look at these images from an image that we would have probably thrown out, right? This would have been tossed out, to an image that now we can do something with, print, share, and be proud of. So having the ability to shoot in RAW in the first place makes a huge difference. So let's try just a couple of more. Here's another image, way too dark. Let's go into develop module. We'll go to single frame here so we can see what we're doing. And let's bring up the exposure. Wow, okay, now we have something going here. We can actually lighten up the shadows here, and you can see all the detail that's happening inside the barn that wasn't there before. So having the ability to come into Lightroom and fix an image that was basically lost, right? That was lost to something that is usable is so great. And you can take this to an extra step and start being a little more creative with images. So here's an image, for instance. We can take our shadows and slide those completely down to make sure that our shadows are a complete silhouette. We could take and, let's take our color. Let's go down to hue and saturation and go into saturation. Grab this little tag tool, which I'll show you that again in a video coming up. Pick like the orange and then slide up and just enhance just the orange of that image. We can go into the masking features that they have, and we can say, okay, let's take a linear gradient, and we're going to just pull that down across the sky. And then instead of, we can darken it a little bit, but we can also go in and let's just take a little color swatch, grab some violet, and now we've just put an image that put a little violet into that image. Now, if you look at this, this is an image to me that I just think looks way better than it did if you were to have nothing in it. So if we go back to the way it was, that's, pretty blah. But if you want to add things to it, you can take creativity to a RAW file and make things whatever it is you want. So to me, it saves me all the time. So here's a shot of a red-tailed hawk that I photographed. Great shot, but look at this. It's a little dark in here, right? I want to bring that up. So simply taking the shadows and lifting those shadows can bring up detail inside this bird's feathers and make it something that we really want to share. So for me, shooting in RAW is a no-brainer. I always shoot in RAW because I know that I'm not perfect, and the images that I create, I want to be able to do even more to them once I get back to the computer. It's not a lot of work. It's something worth learning, and it can really, really improve your images. So let's see if we've got any more here, and then we'll just finish up. Here's another example of one that was shot way too bright. Go in the develop module, and we drag that exposure back. We drag our highlights back. We lift our shadows. And ultimately, when we're creating an image like this, we take an image that was, again, we were going to throw out probably, to an image that has a lot of detail. And if you want to take it a few steps further, you can go into Photoshop and create an image like this, where it's the same image, and we can just build it like this. So this is a little more intense, but you don't have to do that. But you do have that ability, if you've shot in RAW, to start bringing in details that were lost in your original exposure. To sum up, the advantages of Jpeg are not all that great in the long run. The fact that they're smaller and don't take up that much space on your hard drive isn't that important these days with the cost of storage being so much more inexpensive. The cost of a few extra memory cards is the only thing that's separating you from having complete control over your images. And the cost of new cards, especially SD cards, are not that expensive. That's why you bought the good camera in the first place, to create better images. Let RAW allow you to create those better images. Shoot RAW, learn RAW processing like in Lightroom, and gain all that control over your images. Thanks again. I'm Terry Vanderheiden. More videos to come.